The silence of San Francisco had never been so fragile. Picture yourself walking through the muddy streets of that small harbor town in May of 1848, where the morning fog rolls in from the bay like a soft gray blanket settling over wooden buildings and dirt paths. The air carries the salt of the Pacific, the faint smell of wood smoke from nearby chimneys, and something else, something electric and strange, a tension that seems to hum just beneath the surface of ordinary life. On this particular morning, a man named Sam Brannan stood at the corner of Montgomery Street, his boots planted firmly in the California mud. He was 28 years old, a newspaper publisher and merchant, and in his right hand he held a small glass vial that caught the pale morning light. Inside that vial, something glittered, something that would change everything. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine Brannan lifting that vial toward the gray sky. The few dozen people walking past him that morning had no idea that their quiet world was about to shatter into 1,000 golden pieces. They were fishermen heading to the wharf. They were shopkeepers opening their doors. They were women carrying baskets of bread. They were living the last peaceful moments of a California that would never exist again. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Brannan had learned about the discovery only days before. A carpenter named James Marshall had been building a sawmill for a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter, about 50 miles east of Sacramento, along the rushing waters of the American River. On the 24th of January, Marshall had noticed something strange in the mill race, that narrow channel where water powered the mill wheel. Small flakes of yellow metal glinted in the cold mountain water. Slowly, the scene shifts to that quiet morning at Sutter's Mill, where Marshall knelt beside the rushing stream with numb fingers and a racing heart. The Sierra Nevada mountains rose behind him, their peaks still white with winter snow. The sound of the river filled the air, constant and ancient, unchanged for thousands of years. And there, in the palm of his weathered hand, lay several small nuggets that would prove heavier than anyone could imagine. Marshall showed the flakes to Sutter, and the two men tested them. They bit the metal between their teeth, feeling it give slightly, soft as lead, but more beautiful than anything they had ever seen. They boiled it in lye. They hammered it flat. Everything they tried confirmed what they hoped and feared in equal measure. This was gold. Pure, gleaming, undeniable gold. Imagine the sounds of that discovery. The whisper of wind through pine trees. The endless murmur of the river over stones. The hammering of two hearts that suddenly beat faster. Sutter wanted to keep the discovery secret. He had built his entire empire on farming and ranching, and he knew that the announcement of gold would bring chaos to his carefully ordered world. But secrets have a way of slipping through closed fingers like water, like sand, like time itself. Close your eyes and see the faces of Sutter's workers as word began to spread. First in whispers, then in excited conversations over evening meals, then in letters sent to distant relatives, then in newspaper articles that traveled by ship and horse and foot across the continent and eventually around the world. The secret was never really a secret at all. It was simply waiting for someone bold enough to shout it from the rooftops. And that someone was Sam Brannan. But there was a quieter detail, almost easy to miss. Brannan was not a man who did things without reason. In the week between learning about the gold and announcing it to the world, he had been very busy indeed. He had traveled from his store near Sutter's Fort to San Francisco and back. He had visited every merchant in the region, and he had purchased, quietly and methodically, every pickaxe, every shovel, every gold pan, every piece of mining equipment that could be found within 100 miles. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider what Brannan understood that others did not. The real gold was not in the rivers. The real gold was in the dreams of men who would come searching for it. And those men would need supplies. They would need tools. They would need food and shelter and clothing and medicine. They would need everything, and Brannan intended to sell it to them. On that foggy May morning, Brannan raised the glass vial above his head and began to walk down Montgomery Street. His voice rang out through the quiet town, cutting through the morning stillness like a church bell announcing the end of one age and the beginning of another. "Gold!" he shouted. "Gold from the American River! And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed." The effect was immediate and total. Within hours, San Francisco began to empty. Shopkeepers locked their doors and never returned. Sailors abandoned their ships in the harbor, leaving the vessels to rot at anchor. Farmers walked away from half-plowed fields. School teachers dismissed their students forever. The newspaper that Brannan himself published, the California Star, ceased printing because every single worker had left for the gold fields. Let yourself drift back to that spring of 1848, when the population of San Francisco dropped from perhaps 800 souls to barely 200 in a matter of weeks. The streets that had buzzed with the ordinary business of life fell silent. Houses stood empty with doors swinging open in the sea breeze. It was as if a strange fever had swept through the town, leaving behind only those too old, too sick, or too sensible to chase the golden dream. Still, one small piece did not quite settle into place. Not everyone who heard Brannan's announcement immediately understood what it meant. For some, gold was simply another rumor in a territory already full of wild tales and broken promises. California had been Mexican land just 2 years before. It had been conquered in a war that many considered unjust. The future was uncertain, and rumors of easy riches had a way of turning to dust. But this rumor was different, because this rumor was true. In the gentle flow of time, word of the discovery began to ripple outward from San Francisco like a stone dropped in still water. First it reached the towns along the coast, then it traveled south to Monterey and north to the Oregon Territory. Ships carried the news to the Sandwich Islands, which we now call Hawaii, and to the ports of Chile and Peru and Mexico. By summer, the first foreign fortune-seekers had begun to arrive, their eyes bright with hope and their pockets full of borrowed money. Picture yourself walking through the foothills of the Sierra Nevada in that golden summer, where the American River winds through valleys of oak and pine. The water runs cold and clear, tumbling over rocks worn smooth by centuries of patient flow. Wildflowers bloom on the hillsides, purple and yellow and white. The air smells of warm earth and dry grass, and the faint mineral tang of the river itself. And everywhere, kneeling in the shallows with pans in their hands, men search for the yellow metal that will change their lives. The early miners, those who arrived in the summer and fall of '48, found gold almost without trying. They called themselves the 48ers, though history would largely forget them in favor of those who came later. These first arrivals simply waded into streams and scooped up handfuls of gravel that sparkled with flakes and nuggets. Some found the equivalent of 6 years' wages in a single afternoon. Some filled buckets with gold dust as casually as children filling buckets with sand at the beach. And yet, Something about it felt unfinished in the gentlest way. Imagine the sounds of those early mining camps, the splash of water through wooden rockers, the clink of metal pans against river stones, the excited shouts of men who could scarcely believe their luck. Lantern light flickered in canvas tents as the sun set behind the mountains. Campfires glowed orange against the darkening sky. Men who had been strangers weeks before sat together and shared stories of their finds, their plans, their dreams of what they would do when they returned home as wealthy men. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the news continued to spread. In December of 1848, President James Polk addressed the United States Congress and confirmed what many had suspected. California, he announced, contained vast quantities of gold. The official confirmation transformed rumor into fact and hope into certainty. Across the eastern states, in farmhouses and factories and crowded city tenements, ordinary people began to make extraordinary plans. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine a farmer in Ohio reading the president's message in a newspaper by candlelight. His wife stands behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her face uncertain. They have 3 children asleep upstairs. They have a mortgage on the farm. They have relatives they would miss and neighbors who depend on them. But the numbers in the newspaper are staggering. Men earning $20 a day, nuggets the size of hen's eggs, rivers running yellow with gold. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The decision to go west was never simple. It meant leaving everything familiar behind. It meant a journey of 6 months or more across terrain that most Americans had never seen and could barely imagine. It meant the possibility of never returning, of dying alone on some wind-swept prairie or fever-ridden jungle or frozen mountain pass. And yet, by the tens of thousands, they decided to go. Slowly, the scene shifts to the small towns along the Missouri River in the spring of 1849. Independence, St. Joseph, Westport, Council Bluffs. These quiet farming communities had become staging grounds for the greatest mass migration in American history. Every day, more wagons rolled into town. Every day, more men arrived with their supplies and their dreams and their carefully hidden fears. Time moves like honey as we travel to those muddy jumping-off points where the prairies of Kansas and Nebraska stretched westward toward an unimaginable distance. The grass swayed in the spring wind like green waves on a vast ocean. The sky seemed larger than any sky they had known back east, a dome of endless blue that made men feel very small and very brave at the same time. In that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving. The men who gathered at the Missouri River in the spring of '49 were not adventurers by nature. Most were farmers and clerks and shopkeepers, ordinary people who had lived ordinary lives until the news of gold reached their ears. They came from Massachusetts and Virginia and Kentucky and New York. They came from Ireland and Germany and England and France. They came speaking different languages and practicing different faiths, united only by a common dream of golden wealth. Close your eyes and see the wagon trains assembling in the morning mist. Dozens and then hundreds of canvas-topped wagons arranged in long columns that stretched toward the horizon. Oxen lowed and stamped their hooves. Horses whinnied nervously. Children ran between the wagons, not yet understanding the magnitude of the journey ahead. And the adults, the men and women who had chosen this uncertain path, checked their supplies one more time and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong. Picture yourself walking through those camps on the eve of departure, where campfires dotted the prairie like earthbound stars. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted through the cool night air. Men sat in small groups and talked quietly about the trail ahead, about the rivers they would need to cross, about the mountains they would need to climb, about the gold that waited at the end of their long journey. Somewhere in the darkness, a harmonica played a slow and melancholy tune. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. By April of '49, the first wagon trains had begun to roll westward onto the open prairie. The grass was just beginning to turn green, providing forage for the animals that would pull the heavy wagons 2,000 miles to California. The men called themselves 49ers, a name that would echo through history long after most of them had turned to dust. They did not know what lay ahead. They knew only that gold awaited them, and that they were willing to risk everything to find it. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. In the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, spring rains swelled the rivers and washed new gold down from the mountains. The early miners continued their work, growing richer with each passing day, while knowing that soon, very soon, the world would arrive to claim its share. The camps grew larger, the towns grew rowdier, and the gold, that ancient metal born in the hearts of dying stars, waited patiently in the cold mountain water for the hands that would carry it away. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, thousands upon thousands of wagons rolled westward across the empty plains. The 49ers had begun their journey, and nothing, not disease, nor distance, nor death itself, would stop them from reaching the promised land of California gold. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. The spring sun warmed the canvas covers of the wagons as they creaked and swayed across the prairie. Families who had never traveled more than 20 miles from home now found themselves in a landscape so vast and empty that the horizon seemed to curve away in every direction like the edge of the world itself. They traveled in long columns for protection and companionship, their wagons raising clouds of dust that could be seen for miles. Sam Brannan, back in California, watched the ships arrive in San Francisco Bay and counted his profits with quiet satisfaction. His store near Sutter's Fort was doing record business, selling pickaxes at $15 that had cost him 20 cents, selling pans at $16 that were worth perhaps 50 cents. He would become the richest man in California, and he would never dig a single ounce of gold from the earth. And in that silence, the question simply waited, quietly, like a door left ajar in a warm house. The gold rush had begun. The wagons rolled westward. The ships sailed around Cape Horn. The miners worked the rivers of the Sierra Nevada. And somewhere, in the hearts of all those hopeful men, a dream glittered as bright as the metal they sought. A dream that would lift some to riches and crush others into dust. A dream that would transform a quiet corner of the Mexican frontier into the most famous destination in the world. But that transformation came at a price. And as the spring of '49 gave way to summer, as the first wave of 49ers pushed ever westward toward their golden destiny, the trail behind them began to fill with graves. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The story was only beginning. The gold waited in the rivers. The merchants waited in their stores. The native people watched from the hills with growing unease. And somewhere on the endless prairies of Kansas and Nebraska, a wagon wheel creaked slowly through the night, carrying dreamers westward toward a future that none of them could possibly imagine. The record stays slightly open tonight. The journey continues. And the gold, that eternal metal that has driven men to madness and murder and miracles since the dawn of time, gleams softly in the mountain water, waiting for those who would risk everything to claim it. Rest now, and let the wagons roll on without you. The night is quiet over the Sierra Nevada. The rivers flow cold and clear, and somewhere in the darkness, 1,000 campfires flicker on the prairie, marking the path of those who would chase the golden dream all the way to its inevitable end. The story will be here when you wake. In the weeks that followed Brannan's announcement, a strange transformation swept through the territory of California. Ships that had arrived carrying cargo and passengers suddenly found themselves abandoned, their crews having vanished into the hills in search of gold. The harbor of San Francisco filled with empty vessels, their masts tilting at odd angles, their hulls slowly rotting in the salt water, while their owners scrambled for riches in the distant mountains. Picture yourself walking along that abandoned waterfront in the summer of '48, where dozens of ships sat silent and still, their sails furled and their decks empty of all human presence. Seabirds nested in the rigging. Barnacles grew thick on the hulls. The ships had carried men from Chile and Peru and the Sandwich Islands, from China and Australia and every corner of the maritime world. Now they were nothing but wooden shells, monuments to the power of golden dreams. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine the captains and sailors who had left those vessels behind. Some had been at sea for months, crossing vast oceans to reach this distant shore. Some had families waiting for them in ports on the other side of the world. But the gold was stronger than duty, stronger than love, stronger than the ancient code of the sea that bound a man to his ship. They walked away from everything they knew and disappeared into the hills. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The abandoned ships became something unexpected. Enterprising merchants dragged some onto shore and converted them into warehouses and hotels and boarding houses. One ship became a jail. Another became a saloon. The vessels that had carried dreamers across the ocean now sheltered them on dry land, their wooden bones repurposed for a new world that their builders had never imagined. Slowly, the scene shifts to the mining camps themselves, those rough settlements that sprang up wherever gold was found. Imagine a collection of canvas tents clustered along a riverbank, the white fabric glowing in the afternoon sun. Men worked in the shallow water, bent over their pans, their backs aching, and their hands raw from the constant contact with cold water and rough gravel. The sound of their labor filled the valley, a rhythmic splashing punctuated by occasional shouts of triumph or disappointment. The early camps had names that told their own stories. Hangtown, where justice was swift and permanent. Murderer's Bar, where blood had stained the riverbank red. Angel's Camp, named for a merchant whose kindness stood out in a world of sharp dealing. Drunkard's Bar, and Gouge Eye, and Sucker Flat, and Whiskey Town, names that spoke of desperation and violence, and the rough humor of men far from home. In the gentle flow of time, these camps grew into something resembling towns. Merchants arrived with wagon loads of supplies. Saloons opened where miners could spend their dust on whiskey and cards. Laundresses set up business, charging extraordinary prices to wash the filthy clothes of men too busy or too tired to wash their own. And the gold continued to flow from the rivers, filling pouches and jars and tin cans with the soft, yellow metal that made all things possible. Time moves like honey as we traveled to those evening hours in the mining camps, when the work was done and the men gathered around their fires to eat and drink and dream out loud. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, brighter than any stars they had known back east, unmarred by the smoke and lights of civilization. Coyotes called in the distance. Owls hooted from the oak trees, and the river murmured on, as it had murmured for thousands of years, carrying its burden of gold ever downward toward the sea. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. There was a peculiar democracy in those early camps. Doctors worked beside farmers. Lawyers worked beside blacksmiths. Men who had been wealthy back east stood in the same cold water as men who had been poor. The gold did not care about education or family name or social standing. It waited in the gravel for whoever had the strength and luck to find it, distributed according to rules that no human institution could control. But this democracy was imperfect from the start. Not everyone was welcome at the diggings. Not everyone was allowed to work the claims. And as more and more people arrived from around the world, the tensions between them began to simmer like a pot left too long over the fire. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. Meanwhile, the news continued to spread across the world. In December of '48, when President Polk confirmed the discovery to Congress, he also sent along a sample of California gold, a tin box containing 230 ounces of the precious metal. The gold was displayed at the War Department, where thousands of citizens came to see it with their own eyes, to touch the proof that the rumors were true. Close your eyes and see those crowds gathered around the display case in Washington. Farmers and merchants and politicians pressing forward for a glimpse of the yellow metal. Some had never seen gold before, except in the small amounts worn as jewelry or exchanged as coins. Now here was enough to make a man rich, sitting in a tin box as casually as if it were a collection of ordinary stones. The sight was more convincing than any newspaper article, more persuasive than any speech. The gold was real. California was real. And the opportunity to change one's fortune was as close as the next ship bound for the Pacific. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. In the small towns of New England, in the farming communities of the Midwest, in the crowded cities of the Eastern Seaboard, men began to make their plans. They formed companies and partnerships. They pooled their resources to buy supplies. They studied maps of routes they had never traveled and read accounts of lands they had never seen. The gold fever spread through the country like a contagion, touching men who had never gambled on anything more dangerous than a game of cards. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider the magnitude of what was about to happen. In 1849 alone, nearly 90,000 people would arrive in California, roughly half by sea and half by land. They came from every state in the Union and from countries around the world. They spoke dozens of languages and followed dozens of faiths. They were united by nothing except the belief that gold could change their lives, and they were willing to risk everything to prove it. The wagons continued to gather at the Missouri River. The ships continued to round Cape Horn. And in California, Sam Brannan counted his profits while the miners worked the rivers, and the gold dust accumulated in leather pouches and glass jars and the pockets of men who could scarcely believe their good fortune. The record stayed slightly open. The question waited, and the night held its breath over the Sierra Nevada, knowing that the peace of this golden moment could not possibly last. The prairie stretched endlessly westward, and somewhere in its vastness, death was waiting. Picture yourself walking alongside a wagon train in the spring of 1849, where the grass grows tall and green after the winter rains, and wildflowers dot the landscape in patches of color that seem almost too beautiful for this world of mud and toil. The oxen plod forward at their steady pace, 2 miles an hour, 12 miles a day if the weather holds and the rivers are low and nothing goes terribly wrong. The air smells of wet earth and crushed grass and the warm bodies of animals that have been working since dawn. Somewhere behind you, a child is crying. Somewhere ahead, a man is singing a hymn in a voice worn rough by dust and exhaustion. The wagon wheels creak and groan over the uneven ground, a sound so constant that the travelers have long since stopped hearing it, the way a person stops hearing the ticking of a clock in their own home. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine those first days on the trail, when hope still burned bright and the hardships ahead remained hidden beyond the curve of the horizon. The 49ers who set out from the Missouri River in April and May of 49 believed they were embarking on an adventure. They believed they would reach California in 4 or 5 months. They believed they would find gold and return home wealthy. They believed many things that would not survive the journey. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The first week on the trail was almost pleasant. The land was gentle, rolling prairie that offered no serious obstacles to the westward march. The grass was plentiful for the animals. The water was fresh and clear. The travelers learned the rhythms of trail life, the early mornings and long days, the brief rest at noon, the camps made in the evening when the light began to fade. They learned to cook over fires built from buffalo chips when wood was scarce. They learned to circle their wagons for protection. They learned 1,000 small skills that no one back east had ever needed to know. Slowly, the scene shifts to those evening camps, where families gathered around their fires and shared meals that grew simpler as the journey wore on. Bacon and beans and coffee, day after day, until the taste became as familiar as the creaking of the wagon wheels. The children played games between the wagons while their parents talked quietly about the miles ahead, the rivers to cross, the mountains to climb, the gold that waited at the end of their long march. But even in those first easy days, a shadow had begun to fall across the trail. The 49ers had carried something with them from the towns along the Missouri River, something far more dangerous than any obstacle the land could offer. They had carried cholera. In the gentle flow of time, the disease began to claim its victims. Cholera struck without warning and killed without mercy. A man could eat his breakfast feeling perfectly healthy and be dead by sunset, his body racked by cramps and vomiting, his life draining away into the soil of an unmarked grave. The bacteria thrived in the unsanitary conditions of the trail, spreading through contaminated water and food, leaping from camp to camp as the wagon trains passed each other on their westward march. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. Imagine the terror that spread through those camps when cholera arrived. One person would fall ill, and by morning 3 more would be stricken. Families watched helplessly as fathers and mothers and children withered away in a matter of hours. The healthy tried to flee, but they carried the disease with them wherever they went. There was no escape. There was no cure. There was only the grim work of burying the dead and pressing on toward California with the knowledge that any one of them might be next. Time moves like honey as we travel to a single grave beside the trail, marked by a wooden cross that will weather away to nothing within a few years. The man buried beneath the soil was 25 years old. He had left a wife and young child in Connecticut, promising to send for them when he found his fortune. He made it perhaps 400 miles before the disease claimed him. His companions dug his grave deep to keep the wolves away, said what prayers they knew, and moved on toward the west. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. The St. Louis Republican newspaper would later estimate that one person died for every mile and a half of the trail between the Missouri River and Fort Laramie. 5,000 deaths in 1849 alone, according to some accounts, perhaps more. The exact number would never be known, because many graves were unmarked, and many bodies were simply left where they fell, unburied on the open prairie. Close your eyes and see the trail itself, a wide swath of beaten earth cutting across the grassland like a scar. The ruts left by thousands of wagon wheels grew deeper with each passing week, and scattered along that trail, like dark flowers blooming in the spring grass, the graves of those who would never see California multiplied day by day. Picture yourself walking through that landscape of hope and death, where abandoned wagons sat beside the trail with their contents scattered in the grass. Families who could not go on had left behind everything they owned, furniture and tools and books and clothing, treasures that had seemed essential when the journey began, but had become unbearable burdens as the miles wore on and the strength of oxen and men began to fail. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The journey westward was measured not just in miles, but in losses. Oxen died of exhaustion and disease, collapsing in their traces and leaving their owners to somehow continue with fewer animals to pull increasingly lighter wagons. Horses went lame on the rocky ground. Mules balked and kicked and refused to move. The 49ers learned that the land itself was an enemy as formidable as any they had ever faced. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine crossing the Platte River, that shallow and treacherous waterway that the wagons had to ford again and again. The water was thick with sand and debris. The current tugged at wagon wheels and animal legs. Cargo shifted and fell, swept away by the brown water toward some unknown destination downstream. And everywhere, the mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so thick that men wrapped their faces in cloth and breathed through layers of fabric to avoid inhaling the insects. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider the daily routine of trail life. Rise before dawn. Eat a cold breakfast if there was time, nothing if there was not. Yoke the oxen and fall into line. Walk beside the wagon for hours, mile after endless mile, the dust rising in clouds that coated skin and clothing and lungs. Rest briefly at noon if the captain permitted it. Walk again until evening. Make camp, eat, sleep, and then rise before dawn and do it all again. Slowly, the scene shifts to the face of a young woman walking beside her family's wagon, her shoes worn through and her dress faded by sun and washed by rain. She was 18 years old when she left Missouri. She had been engaged to a young man who promised to build them a fine house in California with the gold he would surely find. Now that young man lay buried 300 miles behind her, dead of a fever that no one could explain, and she walked on alone because there was nothing else she could do. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. But there was a quieter detail, almost easy to miss. Not all the deaths came from disease. Accidents claimed their share of victims, too. Men were crushed beneath wagon wheels that slipped on steep descents. Children fell from moving wagons and were trampled before anyone could stop. guns discharged accidentally, killing men who had survived the trail only to die from their own carelessness. And the rivers, those endless rivers that had to be crossed and recrossed, drowned those who misjudged the depth or the current. In the gentle flow of time, the wagon trains began to spread out along the trail, some moving faster and some slower, some taking new routes that promised to save time, and some sticking to the known path. The cohesion of the early days gave way to a grim individualism as families realized that survival might depend on reaching the mountains before the first snows fell. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the Sierra Nevada waited. The 49ers had heard stories of the Donner Party, that ill-fated group of immigrants who had been trapped in the mountains by early snow just 3 years before. They knew that dozens had died of starvation and cold. They knew that some survivors had resorted to eating the bodies of the dead. The mountains ahead were not just an obstacle to be crossed. They were a death trap that would close shut if the travelers arrived too late. And in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving. Picture yourself walking across the alkali flats of what would someday be Nevada, where the white dust burned the lungs and the heat shimmered on the horizon like water that was never actually there. The animals suffered terribly in this wasteland. Their hooves cracked and bled on the sharp crystite soil. Their tongues swelled from thirst. Some simply lay down and refused to move, their eyes glazing over as life drained away beneath the merciless sun. The 49ers pushed on because there was no alternative. Behind them lay 1,000 miles of prairie already crossed. Ahead lay the mountains, and beyond them, California. They could not go back. They could only go forward, one step at a time, 1 mile at a time, one grave at a time, until they reached the promised land or died trying. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Imagine the sounds of that desperate march, the ragged breathing of exhausted animals, the crunch of dry grass beneath countless feet, the occasional crack of a whip urging tired oxen forward. The silence of the desert was broken only by human sounds, sounds of effort and desperation, and occasionally of grief when another traveler fell and could not rise again. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the mental toll of the journey. Men who had been cheerful and optimistic in Missouri became silent and withdrawn after months on the trail. The endless hardship wore away its spirits already battered by loss and fear. Some gave up entirely, sitting down beside the trail and refusing to move, choosing to die in the wilderness rather than take another step toward a destination that seemed to grow more distant with every passing day. The journals and letters that survive from this period speak of unimaginable suffering. One man wrote that he had walked until his shoes fell apart and then continued barefoot, his feet bleeding on the sharp rocks. Another described watching his wife die of cholera and then having to bury her alone because no one else would stop to help. A woman wrote of losing 2 children in a single week and wondering if there could possibly be gold enough in California to compensate for such loss. Slowly, the scene shifts to the base of the Sierra Nevada, where the exhausted survivors of the overland journey finally came face to face with the last and greatest obstacle between them and their destination. The mountains rose before them like a wall, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of autumn. The trails leading upward were steep and rocky, barely passable even for empty wagons, impossible for the loaded vehicles that had come so far. Time moves like honey as we travel to those mountain camps, where families made the terrible decision to abandon most of their remaining possessions. Furniture was cast aside. Clothing was burned for warmth. Books and tools and treasured keepsakes were left in piles beside the trail, monuments to the dreams that had been shed along with everything else on the long road west. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. But the mountains could be crossed. The passes were high, but not impossible. And as the 49ers climbed toward the summit, pushing their lightened wagons over rocky ground, something remarkable happened. They began to descend into California. The air grew warmer. The vegetation grew greener. The scent of pine gave way to the scent of oak and grass and wildflowers. They had arrived. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. Picture yourself standing on a ridge overlooking the Sacramento Valley, where the land spreads out below in a patchwork of green and gold. After months of desert and prairie and mountain, the sight is almost overwhelming. Rivers wind through the valley like silver ribbons. Trees grow in abundance where before there had been only scrub and stone. The promised land is finally, impossibly, real. Close your eyes and see the faces of those who survived the journey, weathered and thin and aged beyond their years, but alive. They had crossed 2,000 miles of wilderness. They had buried friends and family along the way. They had suffered hunger and thirst and disease and despair. And now they stood on the edge of the gold fields, ready to claim the riches that they had paid for so dearly. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The 49ers descended into California with hope renewed, but bodies broken. Many were too sick to work the mines. Many were too poor to buy the supplies they needed. Many had lost everything they owned except the clothes on their backs and the determination in their hearts. The journey had stripped them down to their essential selves, and now they would discover whether those selves were enough to prosper in this strange new land. In the gentle flow of time, the survivors scattered to the mining camps that dotted the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. They learned that gold was harder to find than the newspapers had promised. They learned that prices were higher than anyone had imagined. They learned that the easy riches had already been claimed by those who arrived earlier. But they had come too far to give up now. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, more wagons continued to roll westward. The Great Migration of '49 was not a single event, but a continuous flow of humanity that stretched across months and years. As the first wave of 49ers settled into the goldfields, the second wave was already crossing the prairies, and behind them, still more were gathering at the Missouri River, preparing to make the same journey, to face the same hardships, to bury their dead along the same trail that was already lined with graves. Rest now in the Valley of Arrival. The story continues, but the worst of the journey is behind you. Let the rivers flow down from the mountains, carrying their burden of gold toward the sea. Let the wagon trains fade into the distance, their creaking wheels growing quieter as they cross the prairie toward their uncertain fate. The gold fields wait in the morning light, and the great adventure of the 49ers is about to enter a new and stranger phase. Sleep now, and let California dream around you. The night is gentle over the Sacramento Valley. The stars shine down on camps of hopeful men. And somewhere in the darkness, in the cold rushing water of a mountain stream, the gold glimmers softly, waiting for the hands that will carry it away. The story will be here when you wake. But before the goldfields, before the camps and the claims and the crushing disappointments, there was one more chapter of the journey that deserves to be remembered. The passage around Cape Horn, the sea route that brought nearly half of the 49ers to California, was in many ways as perilous as the overland trail. Picture yourself aboard a crowded sailing ship rounding the southern tip of South America, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans meet in a constant battle of currents and winds. The waves rise as tall as houses. The ship pitches and rolls so violently that passengers must tie themselves into their bunks to avoid being thrown across the cabin. The cold is bitter, even in summer, and the storms seem to last for weeks without end. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine those passengers, many of whom had never been to sea before, huddled in cramped quarters below deck. The air is thick with the smell of vomit and unwashed bodies. The food is salt pork and hardtack, barely edible after months at sea. Fresh water is rationed carefully, never quite enough to quench the constant thirst. And through it all, the ship continues its endless battle with the Southern Ocean. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The voyage round Cape Horn took 4 to 8 months, depending on the weather and the skill of the captain. Some ships never made it at all, lost to storms or fires or the countless hazards of the sea. Those that survived arrived in San Francisco Harbor with passengers who were sick and weak and desperate to feel solid ground beneath their feet again. They had paid dearly for their passage, sometimes $200 or more, a fortune for most working men. And now they faced a city that was nothing like what they had imagined. Slowly, the scene shifts to the harbor of San Francisco in the autumn of '49, where hundreds of ships sat at anchor, their crews having abandoned them for the gold fields. The waterfront was a chaos of activity, men loading and unloading cargo, merchants hawking supplies at outrageous prices, new arrivals stumbling ashore with their possessions on their backs. The city had grown from a few hundred souls to perhaps 30,000 in less than 2 years, and it showed no signs of slowing down. In the gentle flow of time, the newly arrived 49ers tried to make sense of this strange new world. Everything was different from what they had known back east. The prices were staggering. A simple breakfast of bread and eggs cost more than a day's wages back home. A tent to sleep in cost more than a week's rent in a fine hotel. And the gold that had drawn them across oceans and continents, the gold that had cost them everything they owned and everyone they loved, the gold that was supposed to solve all their problems forever, was nowhere to be seen. Time moves like honey as we travel to the streets of San Francisco, where mud was so deep in some places that horses had drowned in it. Wooden planks were laid across the worst stretches, but the planks themselves disappeared into the mire when the rains came. Men wore their pants tucked into tall boots and still emerged from a short walk caked in filth from the waist down. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. But there was a quieter detail, almost easy to miss. Not everyone who arrived in California came seeking gold. Some came seeking those who sought gold, the miners who would need food and clothing and tools and entertainment. These merchants and suppliers and service providers understood something that the 49ers themselves often failed to grasp. The real fortune in a gold rush is made not by those who dig for gold, but by those who supply the diggers. And in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving. Picture yourself in a general store in Sacramento, where the shelves are stocked with goods brought from around the world. Pickaxes hang from the rafters. Gold pans are stacked in towers beside the door. Flour and bacon and coffee line the walls in barrels and sacks. And behind the counter, a merchant watches the parade of hopeful miners with eyes that have learned to calculate profit as quickly as a gambler calculates odds. The prices in that store would have seemed like robbery back east. A pound of coffee that cost 15 cents in New York sold for $40 in Sacramento. A single egg cost $3. A pair of boots that might have been $5 in Boston was $100 here. The 49ers complained bitterly about these prices, but they paid them anyway because they had no choice. The gold was in the mountains, and they had to reach it somehow. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Imagine the sounds of that frontier city. The constant hammering of new construction, the shouts of merchants advertising their wares, the clatter of wagon wheels on wooden boardwalks, the music spilling from saloons where men gambled away their last coins in hope of winning enough to buy supplies for another week. The air smelled of sawdust and horse manure and cooking meat, and the salt wind that blew in from the bay. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider the transformation that had occurred. Just 2 years before, San Francisco had been a sleepy village of perhaps 200 souls. Now it was the fastest-growing city in the world, a place where fortunes were made and lost in a single afternoon, where men lived in tents and ate their meals standing up, where the normal rules of civilization had been suspended in favor of something wilder and more dangerous. But even in that chaos, there were moments of quiet. Even in that frenzy, there were pauses for rest. Close your eyes and see a tired miner sitting on the waterfront at sunset, watching the ships rock gently at anchor in the fading light. He has been in California for 6 weeks. He has found exactly $14 worth of gold. His supplies are running low, and his spirits are lower. The letters he writes home are full of forced optimism, but in the privacy of his own thoughts, he is beginning to wonder if he has made a terrible mistake. The cold water of the American River flowed over hands that had once been soft and now were raw. Picture yourself kneeling in that icy stream in the autumn of 1849, where the morning mist rises from the water like the breath of some great, sleeping creature. Your back aches from bending over. Your knees are numb from the cold. Your fingers have lost all feeling, but still they work. Still they swirl the gravel in the pan. Still they search for the yellow glint that might change everything. This is what gold mining looked like for most 49ers. Not adventure, not excitement, not the triumphant discovery of gleaming nuggets in crystal streams. Just endless, back-breaking labor in freezing water, day after day, week after week, for returns that grew smaller as the easy gold disappeared and the competition grew fiercer. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine the routine of a miner's day. Rise before dawn in a canvas tent that offers little protection from the cold. Eat a hasty breakfast of cold beans and stale bread. Walk to your claim while the stars still shine overhead. Work in the water until your body screams for rest. Eat again at noon if you have food. Work until dark. Return to camp. Eat whatever scraps remain. Sleep. And then rise before dawn and do it all again. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The early miners, those fortunate souls who arrived in 48 and early 49, had found gold almost without effort. They called it placer gold, the loose flakes and nuggets that had washed down from the mountains over thousands of years and accumulated in the beds of streams. A man could simply wade into the water, scoop up a pan of gravel, and swirl it until the heavier gold settled to the bottom. In the early days, $20 worth of gold in a single pan was not unusual. Slowly, the scene shifts to those same streams in late 49, where dozens of men now worked claims that a single man had worked alone just months before. The placer gold was disappearing. The easy discoveries had already been made. The 49ers who arrived after the first wave found themselves fighting over scraps, working harder for less reward, watching their dreams evaporate like the morning mist that rose from the cold water. In the gentle flow of time, the average earnings of miners fell dramatically. In 49, a hard-working miner might earn $10 or $15 a day. By 53, that average had dropped to less than $6. And even that modest return came at a terrible cost in labor and health and spirit. One observer wrote that the miners aged 5 years for every one they spent in the goldfields. But there was a quieter detail, almost easy to miss. While the miners' earnings fell, the prices they had to pay rose ever higher. A cruel mathematics governed life in the goldfields, and that mathematics grew more brutal with each passing month. Time moves like honey as we travel to a general store in the mining town of Sacramento, where a newly arrived 49er stands before the counter with his meager purse and his even more meager shopping list. He needs a pickaxe. He needs a gold pan. He needs food for a week. He needs boots to replace the ones that fell apart on the trail. And as the merchant tallies his order, the miner realizes with growing horror that he cannot afford any of it. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. Picture yourself in that store, surrounded by goods that seem to mock you with their inaccessibility. The pickaxe costs $15, almost a full day's work, even in the best of times. The gold pan is $16. A single loaf of bread costs $2. A single egg costs $3. The boots that would save your bleeding feet cost nearly $100, more than many men earned in a month back east. The merchant watches your face as you calculate, and in his eyes there is neither sympathy nor cruelty, only the calm assessment of a businessman who knows that you have no choice but to pay. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the economics of the gold rush. The 49ers had been told that California was a land of opportunity, a place where any man could become wealthy through hard work and determination. What they found instead was a place where the ordinary rules of economics had been suspended, where prices bore no relation to value, where the cost of living was so high that most miners spent their earnings as fast as they could dig them from the ground. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The newspapers back east printed stories of men who struck it rich, of nuggets the size of hen's eggs, of miners who became millionaires overnight. These stories were not entirely false. Some men did find spectacular quantities of gold. But for every miner who struck it rich, 100 others found barely enough to survive. And for every 100 who survived, dozens more lost everything they had and joined the growing ranks of the desperate and destitute. Close your eyes and see a boarding house in San Francisco where 30 men sleep in a single room on beds stacked 3 high like cordwood. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco smoke, and the cheap whiskey that helps men forget their troubles for a few hours. The cost of this miserable accommodation is $20 a week, more than most of these men can afford, more than any of them would have paid for a fine hotel back home. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider what happened to the men who could not afford even this meager shelter. They slept in doorways and under bridges. They slept in the abandoned ships that filled the harbor. They slept in the open air, wrapped in whatever rags they could find, hoping that the mild California weather would not turn cold enough to kill them. The gold rush that had promised to make them all wealthy had instead reduced many to poverty more desperate than anything they had known before. Slowly, the scene shifts to a mining camp in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, one of hundreds that dotted the landscape in those frantic years. The camp has a name like Hangtown, or Murderer's Bar, or Drunkard's Flat, a name that tells its own story of violence and desperation. Canvas tents cluster along the riverbank, their white surfaces stained by smoke and rain, and the red mud that seems to coat everything in this country. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. In the gentle flow of time, the miners in that camp have learned to live with constant disappointment. They have learned that the gold is harder to find than they expected. They have learned that the prices are higher than they can bear. They have learned that their fellow miners are competitors, not companions, rivals for a shrinking pool of wealth. The camaraderie of the early days has given way to suspicion and resentment and occasional violence. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the merchants continue to prosper. This is the dark truth that the newspapers back east rarely mentioned. The real fortunes of the gold rush were made not by the men who dug for gold, but by the men who sold them shovels. Sam Brannan, who had announced the discovery in San Francisco, became the richest man in California without ever touching a gold pan. He simply bought up all the mining supplies he could find and sold them at enormous markups to the desperate miners who poured into the territory. And in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving. Picture yourself in Brannan's store near Sutter's Fort, where the shelves overflow with goods that miners will pay any price to obtain. Gold pans that cost 50 cents in the eastern states sell here for $16. Pickaxes that cost perhaps $3 back home sell for $15 or $20. Even basic necessities like flour and bacon carry price tags that would have seemed like robbery anywhere else. But this is California in the gold rush, and robbery has become the normal way of doing business. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Brannan was not alone in this enterprise. Dozens of merchants followed his example, importing goods from around the world and selling them at whatever price the market would bear. Ships arrived in San Francisco carrying tea from China and furniture from France and tools from England, all bound for the insatiable market of the gold fields. The merchants grew wealthy. The importers grew wealthy. The ship owners grew wealthy. And the miners, the men who had come to California to find their fortunes, spent their meager earnings on supplies that allowed them to continue searching for gold that grew harder to find with each passing day. Imagine the sounds of a mining camp in the evening when the work is done and the men gather around their fires to eat and drink and contemplate their situation. The splash of water has finally ceased. The clang of pickaxes against rock has faded. Now there is only the crackle of flames, the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter from men who have learned to find humor in their own misfortune. Someone is playing a harmonica. Someone else is reading a letter from home by the firelight, his face illuminated by the flickering glow. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. The letters that miners sent home during the gold rush make for heartbreaking reading. They are full of apologies for not sending money as promised. They are full of explanations for why the gold has been so hard to find. They are full of optimistic predictions that the next week, the next month, the next season will surely bring the success that has so far eluded them. And between the lines of forced cheerfulness, The desperation bleeds through like water through canvas. One miner from New York wrote to his wife that he had lived and fared like a dog during his time in California. His dreams of wealth had long since perished. He had found enough gold to survive, but not enough to prosper. Not enough to send for his family. Not enough to justify the sacrifice of leaving everything he knew and loved. The letter was discovered among his possessions after he died of fever in a mining camp. He never made it home. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider how many 49ers shared this man's fate. They came to California with dreams of gold and found instead exhaustion and disease and poverty. They spent their best years digging in freezing streams and sleeping in canvas tents and eating food that slowly poisoned their bodies. They died far from home, buried in unmarked graves, their names forgotten by history. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. But not all stories ended in tragedy. Some miners did find gold, did make their fortunes, did return home wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. The gold was real, after all. The rivers of the Sierra Nevada really did contain vast quantities of the precious metal, accumulated over millions of years, waiting for the hands that would carry it away. The question was simply, who would find it and who would not? Who would prosper and who would perish in the attempt? Slowly, the scene shifts to a successful miner counting his earnings in a San Francisco bank. Gold, dust, and nuggets heaped on the scales like a mountain of yellow treasure. He has been in California for 2 years. He has worked harder than he ever worked in his life. He has survived cholera and accidents and violence. And now, finally, he holds in his hands the fortune that he came to find. But as he looks at that gold, something in his eyes suggests that the cost may have been higher than the reward. Time moves like honey as we travel to the saloons and gambling halls, where fortunes were won and lost in a single evening. The gold that miners had labored months to collect could disappear in hours at the card table, squandered on games of chance that favored the house, on whiskey that clouded judgment, on women who knew how to separate men from their money. The camps were full of men who had been rich yesterday and were poor today, who had held their fortunes in their hands and watched them slip away like water through fingers. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Close your eyes and see the face of a miner who has decided he has had enough. He has spent his last dollar. He has dug his last hole. He has swirled his last pan of gravel in the cold mountain water. Now he stands at the crossroads of his life, wondering whether to try again or to admit defeat and find some other way to survive in this strange land where everything he knew has proven wrong. Some miners gave up and went home, returning to the eastern states poorer than when they left, but alive and wiser for the experience. Some stayed in California and found other work, becoming farmers or merchants or laborers in the growing economy that the gold rush had created. Some disappeared into the wilderness, their fates unknown, their stories untold, their graves unmarked and unmourned. In the gentle flow of time, the character of the gold rush began to change. The individual miner with his gold pan was being replaced by larger operations with more sophisticated equipment. Companies brought in hydraulic mining, which used powerful jets of water to wash away entire hillsides. They brought in hard rock mining, which dug tunnels deep into the mountains to reach veins of gold-bearing quartz. The era of the lone prospector was coming to an end, replaced by an industrial approach that would continue for decades. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, new miners continued to arrive. The Great Migration of '49 was not the end, but only the beginning. More wagon trains crossed the prairies in '50 and '51 and '52, bringing more hopeful souls to the gold fields of California. The trails grew more established, the routes grew safer, but the gold grew harder to find, and the new arrivals faced even longer odds than those who had come before them. Rest now in the quiet of the mining camp. The story continues, but this chapter can pause for a while. Let the fires burn low and the voices fall silent. Let the exhausted miners find what rest they can before another day of labor. Let the gold wait in the cold mountain water, patient as it has been for millions of years, unchanged by the frenzy of human activity that swirls around it. Sleep now, and let California dream around you. The night is gentle over the Sierra Nevada. The stars shine down on 1,000 scattered camps. And somewhere in the darkness, men dream of gold that will make all their suffering worthwhile. Dreams that may come true, or may prove as false as the morning mist that will burn away when the sun rises over the mountains. The story will be here when you wake, but before the dawn comes, before another day of labor begins, there is more to tell about the strange economy that governed life in the gold fields. The prices that miners paid were not merely high. They were unlike anything that Americans had ever experienced, a distortion of normal commerce so extreme that it seemed almost like a fever dream. Picture yourself sitting down for breakfast in a boarding house near the mines, where a plate of beans and bacon and 2 slices of bread will cost you $5, the equivalent of perhaps $150 in the money of a later age. The eggs on your neighbor's plate cost $3 each. The coffee in your cup cost $40 per pound. The butter that melts on your bread was shipped from New York around Cape Horn and sells for $6 per pound. You eat quickly, not because you are hungry, but because every moment in this establishment costs money you cannot afford. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the cruel mathematics of mining camp life. A successful miner in 1849 might earn $15 in a day of hard labor. That same miner would spend $10 or $12 on food and lodging, leaving him with a handful of coins that would barely cover the cost of replacing his worn-out equipment. The gold that seemed so plentiful flowed through his hands like water, never accumulating, never building the fortune that he had come to find. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The men who understood this mathematics best were the merchants who set the prices. They knew that the miners had no choice but to pay whatever was asked. There were no other stores, no other suppliers, no other options except to go without. And going without meant death in a land where everything had to be imported from distant shores, where the land itself provided nothing that a miner could eat or wear or use. Slowly, the scene shifts to the laundry businesses that sprang up in the mining camps, where a single shirt could be washed for $8, a price that would have bought a fine meal in any restaurant back east. The laundresses were mostly women, some of them wives who had accompanied their husbands to California, others entrepreneurs who had come alone to make their fortunes in a different kind of gold rush. They worked over steaming tubs of water, their hands red and chapped from the harsh soap, earning more in a single day than most miners earned in a week. In the gentle flow of time, some miners learned to do their own laundry, but many could not spare the time from their claims. Others simply wore their clothes until they fell apart, then bought new ones at outrageous prices. The calculation was always the same, always brutal in its simplicity. Time spent not mining was money lost. Every hour away from the river was an hour that might have yielded gold. Time moves like honey as we travel to a doctor's tent in a mining camp, where a man with a broken arm waits to have it set. The doctor charges $50 for this service, more than a week's wages for most laborers back east. But the man will pay it because he has no choice, because his arm must be set or it will heal crooked and useless. Because in the gold fields, there is always someone willing to take advantage of another's misfortune. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. And yet, not everyone suffered equally under this cruel economy. The merchants prospered. The gamblers prospered when luck ran their way. The women who provided companionship to lonely miners prospered in ways that polite society preferred not to discuss. Even the criminals prospered, stealing gold from those too tired or too drunk to protect what they had worked so hard to find. And in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving. Picture yourself in a gambling hall on a Saturday evening, where miners who have worked all week gather to test their luck against cards and dice and each other. The room is thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey. Kerosene lamps cast unsteady shadows on walls made of canvas and rough-hewn wood. At every table, gold dust changes hands, sometimes by the ounce, sometimes by the pound, won and lost on the turn of a card. Imagine the sounds of that place, the slap of cards on wooden tables, the rattle of dice in leather cups, the clink of gold dust being weighed on small scales, the occasional shout of triumph or groan of despair. The miners come here to forget their troubles for a few hours, to feel the thrill of possible wealth without the labor of digging in cold streams. But for most of them, the gambling hall takes more than it gives, leaving them poorer than when they arrived. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The gold that flowed through the mining camps rarely stayed in the hands of the men who dug it from the ground. It passed from miners to merchants, to gamblers, to bankers, to ship owners, to the vast network of commerce that connected California to the rest of the world. The 49ers were not the end point of the golden stream, but merely a channel through which it flowed on its way to other destinations. Close your eyes and see a banker in San Francisco counting gold bars in his vault, each bar representing the labor of 1,000 miners, the hopes and dreams and disappointments of men who never saw that particular gold gathered in such quantity. The banker does not know their names. He does not know their stories. He knows only the weight and purity of the metal, its value in dollars and cents, its place in the ledgers that track the flow of wealth through his establishment. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider the transformation that the gold rush wrought upon California and the world. The yellow metal that flowed from the Sierra Nevada helped finance the growth of American industry. It funded railroads and factories and banks. It enriched a few men beyond measure and impoverished many others beyond recovery. It was the fuel that powered the expansion of a nation across a continent, the glittering promise that drew millions westward into lands that had never known the tread of European feet. Slowly, the scene shifts to a quiet spot along the American River, where an old miner sits alone in the evening light. He has been in California for 5 years now. He has found enough gold to survive, but not enough to go home. The fever that brought him here has long since cooled, replaced by a quiet acceptance of his fate. He will die in California, he knows, far from the family that has long since stopped expecting his return. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. But even in that quiet acceptance, there is a kind of peace. The man has learned things about himself that he never knew before. He has discovered depths of endurance and resilience that surprised him. He has made friends among his fellow miners, men who understand what he has been through, because they have been through it too. The gold rush may have failed to make him wealthy, but it has taught him lessons that no amount of gold could buy. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the quiet heroism of ordinary men who faced extraordinary circumstances. They did not ask to be heroes. They did not seek adventure for its own sake. They simply wanted a better life, a chance to provide for their families, an escape from the grinding poverty that awaited them if they stayed at home. The gold rush promised to make their dreams come true. It kept its promise for a few and broke it for many more. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. In the gentle flow of time, the mining camps began to take on a more permanent character. Canvas tents gave way to wooden buildings. Dirt paths became streets with names and addresses. Churches and schools appeared alongside the saloons and gambling halls. The wild frontier was slowly being civilized, transformed by the very men who had come to exploit it into something that resembled the society they had left behind. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the gold continued to flow from the mountains. It would flow for decades more, long after the 49ers had become old men, and then memories, and then names forgotten by everyone except a few descendants who kept their letters and journals. The gold rush of '49 was not an ending, but a beginning, the first chapter of a story that would continue for generations, shaping California and America in ways that none of the original miners could have imagined. The violence came quietly at first, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Picture yourself in a mining camp in the summer of 1852, where the evening air hangs heavy with heat and tension. The American miners have gathered in a circle, their faces hard with resentment, their voices low but angry. At the center of their attention stands a group of Chinese workers who arrived last month, men who have committed no crime except the crime of being different, of speaking a language no one understands, of wearing clothes that mock them as foreign. The Chinese miners called California Gumsan, which means Gold Mountain in their language. They came from the southern provinces of China, from villages devastated by war and famine, seeking the same golden dream that had drawn Americans from the eastern states. They were willing to work harder than anyone, willing to take the claims that others had abandoned, willing to sift through gravel that American miners considered worthless. And for this, they were hated. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine what it was like to be Chinese in the California gold fields. Every day brought new humiliations. Every night brought the fear of violence. The American miners considered them competitors, thieves who were stealing gold that rightfully belonged to white men. The newspapers printed editorials calling for their expulsion. The government imposed special taxes designed to drive them away. And when legal measures failed, the miners took matters into their own hands. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. In 1850, California passed a law called the Foreign Miners Tax. It required all non-citizens to pay $20 per month for the privilege of working the gold fields. $20 was an enormous sum, more than most miners earned in a week of hard labor. The law was aimed primarily at Mexican miners, who had been among the first to arrive in California, and who knew techniques of gold extraction that American miners had never learned. Faced with this impossible burden, most Mexicans left the gold fields and returned to their homeland. Slowly, the scene shifts to the Chinese camps that remained after the Mexicans departed. The tax was briefly repealed, but then reimposed in a different form, this time at $3 per month and rising every year thereafter. The Chinese miners paid it because they had no choice, because the alternative was expulsion or worse. By 1870, Chinese miners had paid more than $5 million in foreign miners' taxes, nearly a quarter of all state revenue during those years. In the gentle flow of time, the hatred toward Chinese miners grew rather than diminished. Newspapers reported violence as casually as they reported the weather. 200 Chinese robbed at Rich Gulch, 4 murdered. A Chinese camp burned to the ground near Mariposa. A Chinese miner beaten to death in Chili Gulch while his companions fled into the hills. The perpetrators were rarely caught, never punished. In 1854, California passed a law preventing Chinese people from testifying against white men in court. After that, even witnesses to murder could not speak. But there was a quieter detail, almost easy to miss. Time moves like honey as we travel to a small Chinese community in San Francisco, the first Chinatown in America, where families huddled together for protection in a world that wished them gone. The streets were narrow and the buildings crowded close, but within those walls, the Chinese created a world of their own, with stores that sold familiar foods and temples where they could worship in peace, and newspapers that kept them connected to the homeland they might never see again. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. Picture yourself walking through that early Chinatown in the evening, where paper lanterns glow red and gold against the gathering darkness. The smell of cooking rice drifts through open windows. The sound of unfamiliar music floats from a doorway. Old men sit on stoops and watch the street with eyes that have seen too much. Young men hurry past on errands they do not explain. Women remain invisible behind closed doors, rarely seen by the outside world that despises them. The Chinese miners who survived the gold fields often found other work in California. They opened laundries, charging outrageous prices that the desperate miners were willing to pay. They opened restaurants. They built railroads, doing the most dangerous work for the lowest wages, dying by the thousands in explosions and accidents that were covered up or ignored. They became an essential part of California's economy while remaining forever outside its society. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the ultimate fate of Chinese immigration. The hatred that burned in the gold fields of California eventually swept across the entire nation. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first and only law in American history to specifically bar immigration based on nationality. The Chinese who were already in America could stay, but no others could join them. Families were separated for decades. Dreams of reunion faded into dust. The Gold Mountain had become a prison without walls. But the Chinese were not the only victims of the California gold rush. There was another group whose suffering dwarfed even theirs, a people whose presence on this land preceded all others by thousands of years, a people who would pay the highest price of all for the gold that lay in their rivers. Slowly, the scene shifts to a village of the Nisenan people in the Sacramento Valley, where families have lived for generations beyond counting. The land provides everything they need. The rivers give fish. The forests give acorns. The meadows give game. They have developed a complex society with its own laws and customs and beliefs, a civilization as sophisticated in its way as any in the world. And now, in the space of a few terrible years, all of it will be destroyed. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. Before the gold rush, perhaps 150,000 Native Americans lived in California. They spoke more than 80 different languages. They belonged to hundreds of distinct tribes and bands, each with its own territory, its own traditions, its own way of understanding the world. The Spanish missionaries had brought disease and forced labor, but the native peoples had survived. The Mexican rancheros had taken their land, but the native peoples had adapted. Nothing had prepared them for what was coming. Close your eyes and see the faces of the first Nisenan who encountered the miners at Sutter's Mill. They did not know what the yellow metal meant to the strangers. They did not understand why these men would work so hard to collect something that could not be eaten or worn or used. Gold had no value in their world. It was simply another stone in the river, neither more nor less precious than the water that flowed over it. But to the miners, it was worth more than human life, and in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving. The violence against California Indians was not incidental to the gold rush. It was deliberate, systematic, and supported by the highest levels of government. In 1851, the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, addressed the state legislature with words that would echo through history like a death sentence. A war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, he declared. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. Imagine the sounds of that speech echoing through the chambers of government, those measured words calling for genocide while wrapped in the language of regret and inevitability. The legislators nodded in agreement. The newspapers printed the speech without comment. The voters re-elected Burnett without hesitation. The extermination that he predicted and encouraged was already underway. Picture yourself in a California Indian village in the early morning hours, when the fog still clings to the ground and the birds have just begun their songs. The people are sleeping. The children dream peaceful dreams. And then, without warning, the militia arrives. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The state of California spent more than $1.5 million on campaigns against Native Americans during the gold rush years. This was an enormous sum at the time, enough to fund small armies that swept through the valleys and foothills, burning villages, killing men and women and children, driving survivors from the lands where their ancestors had lived since time beyond memory. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the scale of this destruction. In 1850, around 400 Pomo people, including women and children, were massacred by soldiers and volunteers at Clear Lake. Among the few survivors was a 6-year-old girl named Nika, who stayed alive by hiding in the water and breathing through a reed. She grew up to tell her story to those who would listen, one small voice bearing witness to a horror that most Americans preferred to forget. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider what was lost in those years. Not just human lives, though more than 100,000 California Indians died during the first 2 decades of American rule. Not just villages and homes and sacred places, but entire ways of understanding the world, languages that held within them thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, ceremonies that connected the living to the dead, stories that explained how the universe came to be and what it meant to live a good life within it. Slowly, the scene shifts to a reservation where the survivors were eventually confined, a fraction of their original territory, far from the rivers and forests they had known. They were told to become farmers, to abandon the ways of their ancestors, to forget everything they had ever learned. Their children were taken to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their native languages, where their hair was cut and their clothes were changed, and their names were replaced with European substitutes. In the gentle flow of time, the native population of California fell from 150,000 to less than 30,000. The survivors carried within them a grief too deep for words, a loss too vast for tears. They had witnessed the end of a world, and they were expected to build new lives in the ruins of everything they had loved. Time moves like honey as we travel to the present day, where the descendants of those survivors continue the long work of healing. The languages that were nearly lost are being taught again. The ceremonies that were forbidden are being performed again. The stories that were silenced are being told again. It is slow work, painful work, work that will take generations to complete. But it is happening because the people refused to be exterminated, refused to disappear, refused to let their ancestors' deaths be the final chapter of their story. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. Meanwhile, the gold continued to flow from the mountains, indifferent to the suffering it had caused. The rivers ran red with the blood of the innocent, then ran clear again, carrying their burden of precious metal toward the sea, as they had done for millions of years. The gold did not care who dug it from the ground. It did not care how many died in its pursuit. It was simply metal, ancient and beautiful, and utterly without conscience. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the American River in the quiet of evening, where the water glimmers with the last light of day. The miners have gone home. The camps are quiet. The gold waits in the gravel as it has always waited, patient and eternal. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the voices of those who came before, the native peoples who fished these waters for thousands of years, the Chinese who worked abandoned claims for whatever scraps remained, the 49ers who dreamed of wealth and found instead a complex story of triumph and tragedy intertwined. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The human cost of the California gold rush can never be fully calculated. It includes the thousands who died on the overland trail and the sea voyage. It includes the miners who perished from disease and accident and violence. It includes the Chinese who were robbed and beaten and murdered for the crime of being different. It includes the native peoples who lost not just their lives, but their entire world. All of them paid the price for the gold that built San Francisco and funded railroads and filled the vaults of bankers who never touched a gold pan in their lives. Close your eyes and see all of them together, the living and the dead, the victors and the victims, the dreamers who found their fortunes, and the dreamers who lost everything. They are all part of the same story, a story of human ambition and human cruelty, of hope and despair, of gold that gleamed as bright as the sun, and blood that stained the earth as dark as night. Rest now in the shadow of that complicated history. The story continues, but this chapter can pause for a while. Let the rivers flow quiet and dark. Let the ghosts of the past find whatever peace they can. Let the weight of what happened here settle into your bones like the cold of mountain water. A reminder that every fortune comes at a cost. Every dream leaves a shadow. Every triumph writes a story in which someone else is the victim. Sleep now, and let California dream around you. The night is gentle, but the memories it holds are not. And somewhere in the darkness, the gold waits still, unchanged by all the suffering it has caused, ready for whatever hands will come to claim it next. The story will be here when you wake. But before the dawn comes, before another chapter of this story unfolds, there is more to tell about the complicated legacy of violence that the gold rush left behind. The hatred that burned in those years did not simply disappear when the easy gold ran out. It became woven into the fabric of California itself, shaping laws and customs and attitudes that would persist for generations. Picture yourself in a courtroom in Sacramento in 1858, where a Chinese merchant is trying to testify against a white man who robbed his store. The judge stops him before he can speak. The law is clear. No person of Chinese descent can testify against a white person in any California court. The robber walks free. The merchant returns to his store with nothing except the knowledge that the law itself has become his enemy. Feel the weight of history around you as you imagine the countless crimes that went unpunished because of that law. Murders, assaults, robberies, arson. All of them committed against Chinese victims who could identify their attackers but were forbidden from speaking. The criminals learned that they could do whatever they wished to the Chinese community without fear of consequences. And they did. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The foreign miners' tax was just the beginning of the legal assault on Chinese immigrants. In 1855, California passed a law requiring ship captains to post a $50 bond for every Chinese passenger they carried, an attempt to stop Chinese immigration at its source. In 1862, the state imposed a special poll tax of $2.50 per month on every Chinese person in California. In 1870, the city of San Francisco passed an ordinance requiring all laundries to have their business inspected and approved, a law designed specifically to shut down Chinese-owned laundries. Slowly, the scene shifts to a Chinese family saying goodbye to each other at the San Francisco waterfront. The father is being sent back to China under one of the many laws designed to reduce the Chinese population. His wife and children will stay behind, but they will not be allowed to visit him, and he will not be allowed to return. The separation may last years. It may last forever. There is no way to know. In the gentle flow of time, families like this one were scattered across oceans by laws that had no purpose except to cause suffering. Husbands were separated from wives. Parents were separated from children. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 made it illegal for any Chinese laborer to enter the United States, and the law would remain in effect until 1943, more than 60 years of enforced separation. Time moves like honey as we travel to the pages of the history books that were written about the California gold rush in the decades that followed. You will search those books in vain for the stories of Chinese miners. You will search in vain for the massacre at Clear Lake, for the bounties paid for Indian scalps, for the children sold into slavery, for the villages burned to ash. The official history remembered only the adventure and the gold, the brave pioneers who tamed a wilderness, the merchants who built an empire from nothing. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. And in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving. But history has a way of surfacing eventually, like gold working its way up through gravel. In 1969, students at San Francisco State University went on strike to demand the creation of ethnic studies programs that would tell the stories that had been suppressed. In 1999, California acknowledged the genocidal policies of its early government. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom formally apologized for what had been done to the state's native peoples, the first California governor to use the word genocide to describe what happened. Picture yourself at that apology ceremony, where descendants of massacre survivors listened as the highest official in the state finally acknowledged what their ancestors had suffered. Some wept. Some nodded grimly. Some felt that the words had come too late to matter. But at least the words had been spoken. At least the silence had been broken. At least the official story was beginning to change. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Imagine the sounds of California today. The traffic on freeways that cross lands where native villages once stood. The construction cranes building towers on ground that holds unmarked graves. The everyday noise of a modern state built on foundations of suffering that most of its residents never think about. The gold rush is ancient history now, something that happened so long ago that it seems almost like a myth. A story of adventure and fortune that bears little resemblance to the complicated truth. Close your eyes and see a classroom where children learn about the 49ers, about the brave pioneers who crossed a continent to seek their fortunes, about the discovery that transformed California from a sleepy backwater into a global destination. The teacher does not mention the cholera that killed thousands on the trail. The teacher does not mention the Chinese who were beaten and robbed. The teacher does not mention the native peoples who died by the tens of thousands. The story is simpler without those details, more comfortable, more American. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider what it means to tell the whole story. It means acknowledging that the gold rush was not simply an adventure, but a catastrophe for many who lived through it. It means admitting that the wealth that built California was extracted at a terrible human cost. It means understanding that the past is not something separate from the present, but something that shapes it, haunts it, demands to be remembered and reckoned with. Slowly, the scene shifts to a modern museum dedicated to the gold rush, where visitors can pan for gold in a reconstructed sluice and imagine themselves as 49ers. The exhibits are bright and engaging, designed to bring history to life. But if you look carefully, you will find smaller displays in quieter corners that tell darker stories. Stories of those who did not prosper. Stories of those who lost everything. Stories of those who died so that others might find their fortunes. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the miners who never went home. Some found gold and stayed in California to spend it. Some found nothing and stayed because they could not afford the journey back. Some stayed because they had nothing to return to, because the families they left behind had given up on them, because the years of absence had made them strangers to everyone they once loved. These men grew old in California, living in boarding houses and miners' cabins, working odd jobs when they could find them, relying on charity when they could not. They told stories of the early days to anyone who would listen, stories that grew more golden with each telling, stories that transformed the misery they had actually experienced into adventures they wished they had lived. The gold rush became myth, while the men who lived it became old. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. In the gentle flow of time, the mining camps emptied, and the ghost towns appeared. Canvas gave way to wood, and wood gave way to ruin. The rivers that had been churned to mud by 1,000 gold pans ran clear again. The hills that had been stripped of trees grew green with new growth. Nature reclaimed what the miners had taken, slowly, patiently, as if the gold rush had been nothing more than a brief fever that had finally broken. Meanwhile, somewhere in the distance, the real gold continued to flow, not from the mountains, but from the businesses that had grown up during the rush. Wells Fargo became one of the largest banks in America. Levi Strauss became one of the most recognized brands in the world. The Big Four railroad barons, who had started as Sacramento merchants, became wealthy enough to build mansions and found universities. They were the true winners of the gold rush, the men who mined the miners. The last light of day faded over the Sierra Nevada, and with it, an era. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the American River in 1855, 7 years after James Marshall first spotted those gleaming flakes in the mill race at Sutter's Mill. The easy gold is gone now, washed from the gravel and carried away to San Francisco banks and eastern factories and markets around the world. What remains lies deep in the mountains, locked in veins of quartz that will require machinery and capital and organized labor to extract. The age of the lone prospector with his gold pan has come to an end. The men who remain in the gold fields are no longer 49ers. They are employees now, working for wages in mines owned by corporations, drilling tunnels through solid rock, operating hydraulic cannons that blast away entire hillsides in the search for ever deeper deposits. The romance of the gold rush has given way to the reality of industrial mining, and the dreams that brought 300,000 people to California have finally been measured against the cold facts of what actually happened. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider the final accounting of the California gold rush. The total value of gold extracted from California between 1848 and 1855 is estimated at nearly $500 million, an almost unimaginable sum at the time. But where did that gold actually go? Who ended up holding it when the dust settled and the camps emptied and the 49ers scattered to the winds? And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The answer is not what the newspapers promised. The miners themselves, the men who did the back-breaking labor of extracting gold from the earth, kept only a small fraction of the wealth they produced. Most of it flowed immediately to the merchants who sold them supplies, to the gamblers who took their earnings at the card table, to the bankers who charged them fees for weighing and storing and transferring their dust. The 49ers were a pipeline through which gold flowed from the mountains to the counting houses of the wealthy. Slowly, the scene shifts to the offices of Sam Brannan, the man who started it all by parading through San Francisco with a vial of gold. Brannan never dug a single ounce of gold from the earth. Instead, he bought supplies cheap and sold them dear, speculated in real estate that multiplied in value as the population exploded, founded banks that charged interest on loans to desperate miners. At his peak, he was the richest man in California, worth perhaps $2 million, more than most 49ers would earn in 100 lifetimes. In the gentle flow of time, Brannan's story took an unexpected turn. He invested in grand schemes that failed. He drank too much. His wife divorced him and took half his fortune. He spent his final years in poverty, living off the charity of others, a cautionary tale about the fleeting nature of gold rush wealth. Even the merchants who prospered could not always hold on to what they had gained. But there was a quieter detail, almost easy to miss. Some of the fortunes made during the gold rush proved more durable than Brannan's. Levi Strauss, who arrived in San Francisco in 1853 and began selling sturdy work pants to miners, built a company that still bears his name today. Henry Wells and William Fargo founded a bank to serve the gold fields that grew into one of the largest financial institutions in the world. The Big Four railroad barons, Leland Stanford and Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins and Charles Crocker, parlayed their profits from Sacramento stores into a transcontinental railroad empire that made them among the wealthiest men in American history. Time moves like honey as we travel to the mansions these men built on Nob Hill in San Francisco, palaces of stone and marble that looked down on the city where they had started as humble merchants. Stanford founded a university in memory of his son. Hopkins left an art collection that became a museum. Crocker built a house so large that it blocked his neighbor's view and sparked a feud that lasted until his death. These were the true winners of the gold rush, the men who understood that the real gold was not in the rivers, but in the pockets of those who came to search for it. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on. Picture yourself walking through the ghost towns that dot the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, places with names like Coloma and Angel's Camp and Bodie, where the ruins of a vanished world slowly crumble back into the earth. The buildings that once housed saloons and general stores and assay offices stand empty now, their windows broken, their roofs sagging, their walls covered with the graffiti of visitors who came to see what was left. The streets that once buzzed with the activity of thousands are silent except for the wind and the occasional tourist. Close your eyes and see those ghost towns in the golden light of evening, when the shadows grow long and the past seems very close. The miners who worked these claims are long dead. The merchants who supplied them are long dead. The children who played in the dusty streets are long dead. But something of their presence lingers in the weathered wood and the rusted metal and the stories that visitors tell each other as they walk through the ruins. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider what the gold rush meant for California and for America. Before the rush, California was a distant territory, barely connected to the rest of the country, home to perhaps 15,000 people of European descent. After the rush, it was a state with a booming economy, a gateway to the Pacific, a symbol of American ambition and expansion. The gold that flowed from the Sierra Nevada helped finance the Industrial Revolution, funded the railroads that bound the continent together, established San Francisco as one of the great cities of the world. Breathe deeply and let the years fade away as you consider the price that was paid for this transformation. The native peoples who had lived in California for thousands of years were nearly exterminated. The Chinese, who came seeking their fortunes, were persecuted and excluded. The 49ers themselves, the ordinary men who did the work and took the risks, mostly went home poorer than when they arrived. Their dreams of wealth evaporated like the morning mist over the mountains. Slowly, the scene shifts to a modern California, where the legacy of the gold rush is visible everywhere. In the names of streets and towns, in the architecture of old San Francisco, in the myths and stories that Californians tell themselves about their state's origins. The gold rush is remembered as an adventure, a founding story, a moment when anything seemed possible. The darker chapters of that story are acknowledged now, but they do not dominate the narrative. The dream is still more powerful than the reality. In the gentle flow of time, the gold continues to come out of California, though in much smaller quantities than during the rush. Modern miners use techniques that would have astonished the 49ers, extracting gold from ore that the old-timers would have thrown away as worthless. The rivers that once ran yellow with disturbed sediment run clear again. The forests that were stripped for timber have regrown. The scars of the gold rush are healing, slowly, as nature reclaims what was taken. There will be nothing to solve right now, only a quiet passing of time. And in that calm uncertainty, the night kept moving. Picture yourself standing at Sutter's Mill, where it all began, where James Marshall spotted those fateful flakes in the cold January water. The mill itself is long gone, burned and rebuilt, and burned again, now recreated as a historical exhibit for tourists who come to see where the dream started. The American River still flows past the spot, unchanged by all that has happened since that winter morning in 1848, when the world suddenly tilted on its axis. Imagine the sounds of that place in the quiet of evening, the rush of water over stones, the rustle of leaves in the oak trees, the distant call of birds settling in for the night. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echoes of the past, the shouts of the first miners to arrive, the rumble of wagon wheels on dirt roads, the hammering of construction as a town sprang up almost overnight. Those sounds have faded now, but they left their mark on everything that came after. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The California Gold Rush was many things at once. It was an adventure and a tragedy. It was an economic boom and a humanitarian disaster. It was the fulfillment of dreams for some and the destruction of dreams for others. It was the beginning of modern California and the end of indigenous California. It was all of these things simultaneously, woven together in a story so complicated that it can never be fully untangled. Close your eyes and see the faces of all those who were part of this story. The 49ers who crossed a continent to find their fortunes. The merchants who sold them supplies at outrageous prices. The native peoples who were murdered and displaced. The Chinese who were persecuted and excluded. The women who came west to make their own way in a world designed for men. The children who grew up in mining camps and carried memories of that wild time into the 20th century. All of them are gone now, but their story remains. Feel the weight of history around you as you consider what we can learn from the gold rush. Perhaps we can learn that dreams of easy wealth are usually illusions. Perhaps we can learn that the cost of progress is often borne by those who have the least power to resist. Perhaps we can learn that the stories we tell about the past shape the world we create in the present. Or perhaps we can simply sit with the complexity of what happened and let it wash over us like the cold water of a mountain stream. Slowly, the scene shifts to the present day, where descendants of 49ers and Native peoples and Chinese immigrants all live together in a California transformed beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined.
The gold that brought them all here still glitters in museums and jewelry stores and the vaults of banks. It has lost none of its luster, none of its allure, none of its power to make people dream of wealth beyond measure.
Time moves like honey as we travel one last time through the Sierra Nevada, past the ghost towns and the modern cities, past the rivers that still carry traces of gold in their gravel, past the mountains that still hold secrets in their ancient stone. The story of the California Gold Rush is the story of America itself, a story of ambition and cruelty, of innovation and exploitation, of dreams that lifted some people up and crushed others beneath their weight. Rest now in the golden light of evening. The story is nearly complete. But stories like this one never really end. They echo through generations, shaping the world long after the last participants have passed from living memory. The 49ers are gone, but their children built a state. Their grandchildren built an economy. Their great-grandchildren are still reckoning with the complicated legacy of what happened in those wild years when gold was king and anything seemed possible. You can let this moment blur softly, and the story will carry on without you for a while. The night settles gently over California. The stars emerge one by one, the same stars that shone down on the miners in their canvas tents, the same stars that guided wagon trains across the prairies, the same stars that watched unmoved as empires rose and fell, and the gold flowed endlessly from the mountains to the sea. And perhaps the answer did not need to arrive tonight. If you have traveled this far with us, through the announcement and the journey, through the camps and the violence, through the boom and the bust, and the long reckoning with what it all meant, then you have heard a story that most people never hear. You have learned things that most people never learn. You have glimpsed a past that is more complicated and more human than the simple adventure story that usually gets told. The gold rush was not just about gold. It was about people. Ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, making choices that would shape the future in ways they could not predict. Some of those choices were brave, some were foolish, some were cruel beyond measure. All of them were human, all of them were real. All of them left marks on the world that we still carry with us today. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed.